"There's no room for this here, Dad," my son said, handing back the leather roll containing my father's 70-year-old chisels, tools that had built half the homes in this town. His wife stood behind him with that cold smile, dismissing decades of family legacy like it was worthless junk. They saw me as nothing more than a sentimental old man clutching to the past. What they didn't know was that I'd spent my entire life finding the weak points in structures before they collapsed, and their perfect life. It was built on lies, held together with the flimsiest joints I'd ever seen. They wanted to erase me from their story, treat me like an embarrassing relic that didn't fit their curated world. So I did what any craftsman does when faced with poor workmanship. I decided to take it apart piece by piece until the whole facade came crashing down. They thought they were rejecting an old man's gift, but what they'd actually done was declare war on someone who knew exactly how to win it. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The drive to Havenwood Bluffs had been quiet. The old leather roll sat on the passenger seat, its familiar weight a comforting presence. Inside, the chisels my father had passed to me lay nestled in felt, their steel edges still sharp after 70 years. Their handles worn smooth by 2 generations of calloused hands felt like an extension of my own soul. It was the perfect housewarming gift, a piece of our family's core, for the home my son had built. But their house wasn't a home. It was a gallery. A sterile white box perched on the shore of the lake, all sharp angles and cold glass. There were no pictures on the walls, no scuff marks on the floor, no soul. Serafina called it minimalist living. I called it empty. The party was just as colorless. Guests drifted through the echoing rooms holding wine glasses and making quiet, polite conversation. Serafina, a self-proclaimed financial freedom coach, moved among them like a priestess in her own temple, her smile bright but brittle. Caleb followed in her wake, a shadow of the boy I'd raised. I found him by the vast window overlooking the water. "Caleb," I said, holding out the leather roll, "for the new house, from your great-grandfather." He took it, his hands hesitating. He unrolled it slowly, the familiar clink of steel against steel sounding alien in that silent room. For a moment I saw a flicker of the boy who used to spend hours in my workshop, the scent of sawdust in his hair. Then Serafina was there. She didn't touch the tools. She didn't even look at them. Her eyes met Caleb's, and the flicker died. That's when he said the words, "There's no room for this here, Dad." He rolled them back up the sound final and pushed them into my hands. His touch was brief, apologetic, but his eyes were firm. He had made his choice. I didn't argue. I just knotted my throat too tight to speak. I walked through their perfect hollow house, past the smiling strangers, and out the front door. The cool Wisconsin air was a relief. As I drove away, the weight of the leather roll on the passenger seat felt heavier than ever. They hadn't just rejected a set of tools. They had rejected a lifetime. They had rejected me. And in the quiet of my old truck, a cold, hard clarity began to form. The truck's old engine hummed a mournful tune as I pulled into my driveway. My workshop, a sturdy oak-beamed sanctuary behind my small house, glowed softly in the fading light. It was a haven filled with the scent of sawdust, linseed oil, and decades of honest work. Here, every tool had a story, every piece of wood, a soul. Unlike their sterile white box, this was a place that breathed. I placed the leather roll of chisels on my workbench, its familiar weight now alien accusing. My fingers traced the worn handles, each groove a memory of my father's strong grip than my own. These weren't just tools. They were a legacy, a living connection to the hands that had built Havenwood Bluffs, one solid piece of furniture at a time, and Caleb had tossed them aside, like junk. "No room for this here, Dad." The words echoed in the quiet, sterile workshop. They stung a fresh cut deeper than any chisel could make. It wasn't about the tools. It was about me, my values, my life. Everything they considered old, outdated, irrelevant. I ran a hand over a half-finished oak chest, its grain rippling under my touch. Esther would have understood. My late wife, always seeing the heart of things, the hidden beauty. She'd loved the workshop, the quiet rhythm of creation. She'd often brought me coffee, sitting on an old stool, just watching me work. "Gideon," she'd say, "you don't just build furniture. You build stories." Her smile even now brought a warmth that fought against the cold knot in my chest. Her words, those stories, they deserved to be told. Not swept away by the latest trend, the newest, emptiest fad, Serafina. Her name tasted bitter on my tongue. Her minimalist living and financial freedom empire, built on air and promises. I pictured her flawless smile, Her perfectly curated posts, a façade, like a cheap veneer over particle board. I opened my old laptop, its screen a dull glow in the dim light of the workshop. My fingers, accustomed to the rough texture of wood, moved slowly over the smooth keys. I wasn't a tech wizard. Esther had handled most of that. But I knew how to find things, how to uncover what was hidden. It was the craftsman's way to examine, to identify flaws, to understand the structure before attempting to restore or rebuild. I started with Serafina's blog, page after page of glossy perfection, sun-drenched photos, aspirational quotes, links to her overpriced online courses, and dubious eco-friendly products. It was all so clean, so bright, so utterly devoid of authenticity. A meticulously crafted illusion designed to separate people from their money. The more I scrolled, the clearer it became. This wasn't about lifestyle, it was about control. About presenting a flawless image, masking a hollow core. Caleb, my son, caught in her orbit, slowly fading, losing the grounded boy I knew. My hands tightened into fists. This wasn't just about my herd anymore. This was about them. My grandchildren, Noah and Iris. Growing up in a world of curated lies. Number I wouldn't stand by. I'd spent my life fixing what was broken, finding the truth in every grain of wood, and now I would apply that same meticulous precision, that same unwavering focus to a different kind of project, her empire, their perfect life. I would find the rot. I would expose the poor craftsmanship. I would show the world the flimsy joinery holding it all together. I leaned back in my chair, the scent of wood and memories filling the air. The leather roll of chisels lay beside me, no longer a symbol of rejection but a silent promise. They wanted to build a new life free of the past. Very well, I would simply ensure it was built on a foundation of truth. And the first step of any good craftsman before striking a single blow is to understand the material, to know its weaknesses. And I was just beginning to study theirs. My workshop was for building things up. Tonight it would be for taking something apart. I sat before the laptop, the glow of the screen pushing back the familiar shadows. My approach to Serafina's online empire would be the same as my approach to a piece of antique furniture, patient, thorough, and honest. I would look for the cheap repairs, the hidden cracks, the veneer covering a weaker wood. For 3 nights I did nothing but read. I treated her blog, her social media, and her online store as a single complex structure. I read every post, every glowing testimonial, every product description. I was looking for the grain of the wood, the natural lines of her narrative. But more importantly, I was looking for the knots, the inconsistencies. Her brand was built on 2 pillars, minimalism and authenticity. She sold the idea of a simple, uncluttered life, free from the burdens of consumerism, and yet her online store was filled with dozens of products. Bamboo utensil sets, organic cotton, throws minimalist ceramic mugs. Each one was branded with her Serene Living logo, and each came with a hefty price tag. The contradiction was the first knot. It was a flaw in the design. I focused on one product, the Serene Earth bamboo utensils. The description was filled with words like sustainably sourced, artisan crafted, and ethically produced. A beautiful story. I didn't believe a word of it. My methods were old-fashioned. I didn't know how to hack or code, but I knew how to look. I saved the professional photos of her utensil set. Then, I started a reverse image search. It took hours scrolling through pages of unrelated junk. But a craftsman is patient. You don't rush the work. Finally, on the 12th page of results, I found it. The exact same photo. Not on an artisan's website, but on a massive overseas wholesale marketplace. The same utensils, the same packaging minus her logo. They weren't artisan crafted. They were mass-produced in a factory. The price per set when bought in bulk was less than $1. She was selling them for $35. The lie was breathtaking in its simplicity. She wasn't a curator of fine goods. She was just a reseller with a good story. I took screenshots, saved links, and compiled everything into a neat, organized folder. The evidence was clean, undeniable, like a perfect dovetail joint. Now I needed a place to send it, not to a newspaper. That was too direct, too loud. This needed to be a quiet, precise cut. I found a small independent blog run by someone who called themselves The Authenticity Audit. Their entire purpose was to expose influencers who preached one thing and practiced another. They were the perfect tool for the job. I created a new email account, something anonymous and untraceable. The message was short, professional, and to the point. I attached the folder of evidence. My finger hovered over the mouse. There was no anger in my heart, no rage. Just the cold, calm focus of a man with a task to do. The same focus I felt when setting a difficult joint or restoring a delicate piece of history. I clicked send. The email was gone. A single digital splinter pushed deep into the polished surface of her brand. Now all I had to do was wait and listen for the crack. I didn't check the website for 4 days. A craftsman doesn't hover over his work. You do the job right. You trust your process, and you let the materials settle. I spent those days in my workshop sanding a maple rocking chair for Iris's upcoming birthday. The rhythmic motion was a meditation, my hands steady, my mind clear. The world outside with its frantic digital pace could wait. On the 5th morning, I poured my coffee, sat down at the old desk, and navigated to the Authenticity Audit blog. And there it was. The headline was simple, sharp, and devastating: Serene Living's Not So Serene Sourcing. The article was methodical, laying out the evidence I had sent with cold precision. It showed the side-by-side comparisons: Serafina's $35 artisan utensils next to the 97-cent factory version. The blogger didn't use hyperbole or outrage. They simply presented the facts. It was more damning than any angry tirade could ever be. The comments section was a wildfire. Hundreds of messages from disillusioned followers. "I can't believe I fell for this," one wrote. Another said, "This is the opposite of minimalist living. It's just cynical greed." The façade was not just cracked. It was splintering before my eyes. I felt a cool, quiet satisfaction. Justice, like woodworking, was a process. I had just closed the laptop when my phone buzzed against the oak desk. The screen lit up with Caleb's name. I let it ring 3 times, took a slow sip of coffee, and then answered my voice, calm and even. "Morning, son." "Dad, did you see it? Are you online?" His voice was high-pitched, laced with a panic I hadn't heard since he'd fallen out of a tree at age 10. "See what, Caleb? I was just heading out to the workshop." The lie was effortless. This blog, some blogger is attacking Serafina. They're saying she's a fraud, that her products are cheap junk from China. It's all lies, Dad, just vicious lies, from someone who's jealous of her success. I listened to him ramble, his words tumbling over each other. I could picture him pacing the cold white floors of that house, his hands running through his hair. "That sounds awful, son," I said, my tone measured, concerned. "Awful, Dad. It's a catastrophe. Her sponsors are calling. People are demanding refunds. Serafina's been crying all morning." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "We don't know who would do this. It's so targeted, so cruel." "Well, son," I said, swirling the coffee in my mug, "when you build something, you're bound to attract critics. Maybe you just have to weather the storm." Inside, I felt a tremor of something hard and unyielding. Cruelty was telling your own father there was no room for him in your life. Weather the storm. "That's it?" he asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. I thought, "I don't know, I just needed to call you. I'm sorry this is happening to you both," I said, and it was almost the truth. I was sorry he was in pain, but I wasn't sorry for the cause. "You two are strong. You'll figure it out." He hung up after a few more minutes of frantic venting. The line went dead, and the workshop was quiet again. He had called me. In his moment of crisis, when the perfect world he'd chosen began to shake, he had called me. But he wasn't looking for a father. He was looking for an ally in his delusion. He bought every word. As I stood up and walked towards the workbench, I looked at my father's chisels, their edges gleaming in the morning light. The first cut had been made, and it was cleaner than I could have hoped. Caleb's panicked voice lingered in my mind for the rest of the day. A small, unwelcome sliver of guilt tried to work its way into my resolve. He was my son, after all, and he was hurting. Had I gone too far? The question was a low hum beneath the surface of my thoughts, a tool I didn't want to pick up. Then came Saturday. My weekend with the grandkids. It was a standing arrangement, one of the few pieces of my old life that Serafina hadn't managed to declutter. I picked up Noah and Iris from the end of their long gravel driveway. The sterile lake house loomed in the background, its windows like vacant eyes. In my truck, the kids were a whirlwind of life and chatter, filling the quiet space with a warmth that had been missing. Noah, at 8, was curious and serious, his mind always working. Iris, at 5, was pure sunshine, her laughter a melody. "Grandpa," Noah said, buckling himself in. "Mommy was crying a lot this week. She broke a plate." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Oh, why was that, buddy?" "She said people were being mean online," he said, his brow furrowed. "She told Daddy that his family was probably happy about it." The words landed like a hammer blow. his family, me. The guilt I'd felt vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. She was poisoning them, turning my own son against me and now planting seeds of division in my grandchildren's minds. Well, I said, keeping my voice light. Sometimes grown-ups get upset over silly things. How about we go to the park? I hear the fish are biting down at the pier. We spent the day under the Wisconsin sun. I taught Noah how to cast a line, his small hands fumbling with the reel. I pushed Iris on the swings until her giggles echoed across the playground. We ate hot dogs from a cart and skipped stones on the calm surface of the lake. It was simple. It was real. It was everything their life in that white box was not. Later, as we sat on a park bench, Iris pulled a small, colorful tablet from her backpack. "Look what Mommy got me," she said. "It's for my creative expression time." On the screen was a simple drawing app, but it was surrounded by ads for Serafina's Serene Kids online course. Learn to monetize your child's creativity, one banner read. I felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. She was turning my granddaughter's playtime into a brand extension. "Grandpa, can you teach me to whittle like you do?" Noah asked, ignoring the tablet completely. He looked from my calloused hands to the lake. "I want to make a little boat, a real one." My heart swelled. In that moment, surrounded by the simple beauty of the day, with my grandson asking to learn a real skill with his own two hands, my purpose became diamond hard. This wasn't about revenge for a rejected gift anymore. This wasn't even about my own hurt feelings. This was a rescue mission. I was fighting for them, for their right to have a childhood filled with scraped knees and sawdust, not monetization strategies and curated content. I was fighting for the legacy of honest work and real connection that Serafina was so determined to erase. When I dropped them off that evening, I hugged them tighter than usual. As I drove away, Caleb's panicked voice was a distant echo. The guilt was gone. In its place was the unwavering resolve of a craftsman with a job to do. I had measured the material and made the first cut. Now it was time to get back to work. The next target wasn't just a product line, it was her financial foundation. My new resolve was a different kind of wood. Not the flexible strength of oak, but the hard, unyielding density of ironwood. My focus shifted from her products to her story. A craftsman knows that a structure is only as strong as its foundation, and Serafina's entire brand was built on one foundational claim. Her journey from crippling debt to financial freedom through the magic of minimalism. I bought her ebook, The Unburdened Wallet. I didn't read it for advice. I read it like an architect studying a blueprint, looking for the load-bearing walls and the points of stress. Her story was compelling, I had to admit. She wrote of maxed-out credit cards, student loans, and a shopping addiction that nearly ruined her. Her awakening came, she claimed, when she sold nearly everything she owned and embraced a life of less. It was a powerful narrative. The problem was, I knew it wasn't the whole truth. I knew for a fact that she and Caleb had put a massive down payment on that sterile lake house, a sum that couldn't possibly have come from selling used furniture and cutting out lattes. There was a missing piece in her financial story. A hidden beam supporting the whole structure. My search began in the digital archives of the Havenwood Bluffs local newspaper and business journals. I was looking for any mention of Serafina before she became Serafina, back when she was just Jocelyn Serafina Vance, a recent business school graduate with big ideas. The work was slow, tedious. I waded through announcements of town fundraisers, articles on local fishing competitions, and ads for hardware stores. For days, I found nothing. It felt like sanding a large, rough piece of lumber. You don't see the progress until you step back, but every pass with the sandpaper is doing its job. My breakthrough came late one night, deep in the archives of a Wisconsin State Business Journal. It wasn't a headline. It was a small mention in a column about regional startups dated 3 years ago. The article was about a Milwaukee-based venture capital fund called North Star Investments, which specialized in seeding promising female-led e-commerce ventures. And there in the final paragraph was the missing beam. Among Northstar's recent investments, it read, is a 6-figure seed investment in Serene Living LLC, a lifestyle brand founded by Havenwood Bluffs native Jocelyn Adler, now Serafina Adler. I leaned back, the creak of my old wooden chair loud in the silent workshop. 6 figures, a seed investment. She hadn't escaped the system. She had leveraged it. She hadn't found financial freedom through minimalism. She had found it through a team of wealthy investors who were expecting a return on their money. Her entire story, the foundation of her brand, was a structural lie. She wasn't a guru who had transcended the need for money. She was a CEO with a product to sell and investors to please. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. The woman selling a life free from financial burdens was completely beholden to them. I saved the article. I found the public records of her LLC listing Northstar Investments as a primary partner. I laid out the evidence on my screen piece by piece, like a master carpenter preparing for a complex assembly. The email to the first blogger had been a splinter. This was different. This was an attack on the foundation itself. Not another blogger, but the very people propping up her lie. The investors themselves. Contacting a venture capital fund was a different challenge. These were not emotional bloggers or disillusioned followers. They were sharks, men and women who dealt in risk and return, profit and loss. My approach needed to be different, not an exposé, but a quiet warning. A professional courtesy from one concerned party to another. I spent a full day researching Northstar Investments. I learned the names of their managing partners, their investment philosophy, their public statements on the importance of founder authenticity. The more I read, the more I understood their vulnerability. They hadn't just invested in a business, they had invested in a story, and I was about to inform them that their story was a work of fiction. This required a new email address, a new persona. I couldn't be a random whistleblower. I had to be someone they would take seriously. I created an email with a bland corporate-sounding name, Risk Analysis, Consulting. It sounded official, boring, and credible. The email itself was a masterpiece of understatement. It was drafted not with the passion of a wronged father, but with the dispassionate precision of a risk analyst. The subject line was simple: a query regarding your investment in Serene Living, LLC. The body of the email was brief and professional. I didn't make accusations. I simply asked questions. To the partners at Northstar Investments, I wrote, I am undertaking a private due diligence report on the lifestyle influencer market. In reviewing the public-facing narrative of Serafina Adler, founder of Serene Living LLC, I've noted a significant discrepancy between her brand's foundational story of debt-free, self-funded minimalism and the public record of your firm's considerable seed investment. Could you clarify if your firm is comfortable with a portfolio company whose primary marketing narrative appears to be structurally at odds with its financial reality? My concern is purely from a brand risk perspective, as a lack of transparency from a founder can often indicate deeper operational issues. I didn't include the articles or the evidence. That would have been too aggressive. Instead, I simply embedded the hyperlink to the Business Journal article within the text, a quiet breadcrumb for them to follow. The implication was clear. I know, and I am assuming you don't, or worse, that you do, and you are complicit. It was the most dangerous thing I had done so far. These were powerful people, but I knew their mindset. They hated surprises. They hated looking foolish. And more than anything, they hated risk they couldn't control. An anonymous tip from a risk consultant was a variable they couldn't ignore. Before I said it, I sat in the quiet of my workshop and thought of my grandchildren. I thought of Noah wanting to build a real boat, and of Serafina wanting to monetize Iris's creativity. This wasn't just about knocking a support beam out from under her. It was about creating a space where my grandchildren could grow up with something real. My finger clicked the mouse. The email was gone. This was no longer a splinter. I had just taken a saw to a primary load-bearing beam. The only question now was how long it would take for the roof to cave in. This time, the silence that followed felt different. It wasn't the quiet satisfaction of watching a small blog post gain traction. It was the heavy charged silence before a thunderstorm. I knew the partners at Northstar Investments wouldn't react publicly. People with that kind of money didn't air their laundry on social media. They moved quietly behind closed doors. I waited a week. I finished the rocking chair for Iris, its maple grain glowing under a final coat of oil. I started planning a new project, a cedar chest for Noah. I worked with my hands, letting the familiar rhythms of the workshop keep my mind steady. I was a patient man. I knew that pressure, when applied correctly, took time to reveal its effect on the wood. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Caleb began, but his voice was different this time. The high-pitched panic was gone, replaced by a low, strained tone that spoke of a deeper fear. "Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "something's wrong." I set down my sanding block. "What is it, son? Is everyone okay?" "I don't know. It's Serafina. She's been locked in her office for 2 days. She had a conference call yesterday with her investors, and ever since, she's different, cold, angry." He hesitated. "She keeps talking about transparency and fiduciary duty. She's pulling financial records, old contracts. She's looking for something." I felt a quiet, cold hum in my veins. The tremors had begun. "Business can be stressful, Caleb. especially when you're growing as fast as she is. No, Dad, this is more than that, he insisted, his voice tight. She looks haunted. Last night I heard her shouting on the phone about a breach of narrative integrity. What does that even mean? And she keeps looking at me, like she's trying to figure something out. The phrase was perfect. Narrative integrity. The corporate jargon for a lie. My anonymous email had hit its mark. The investors weren't pulling out yet. They were applying pressure. They were asking questions. And their questions were shaking the very foundations of the house Serafina had built. And now they want a meeting. Dad Caleb continued, his voice dropping even lower. The partners from North Star. They're flying in from Milwaukee next week. They said it's a routine portfolio review, but it's not. They've never done this before. Serafina is terrified. I'm sure it's nothing I said. My voice, a calm anchor in his storm. She's a smart businesswoman. She'll handle it. But what if she can't? He almost pleaded. What if this is because of that blog post? What if it's all starting to fall apart? Son, I said, my voice firm but gentle. Every structure has to endure a stress test now and then. It's the only way to know if it's built to last. He was silent for a long moment. I could hear his shaky breath on the other end of the line. When he finally hung up, I walked over to a stack of uncut lumber. I ran my hand over a rough slab of black walnut, feeling the tension in the grain, the hidden imperfections beneath the surface. They were doing their due diligence. They were checking the foundations. And I knew, with the certainty of a master craftsman, that they would find them rotten to the core. I kept my distance that week. I didn't call Caleb. I didn't drive past their house. I gave them the space they had so forcefully demanded. My work was done. The mechanism was in motion. Now I was merely an observer waiting for the gears to click into place. But a father always knows. I could feel the tension radiating from that White House on the lake, even from miles away. The signs were small, subtle cracks in the perfect veneer they presented to the world. On Thursday, I was at the local grocery store picking up supplies. I saw Caleb's car in the parking lot. He was inside, standing in the middle of an aisle, staring blankly at a wall of cereal boxes. He looked exhausted. His shoulders were slumped, and he hadn't shaved in days. He looked like a man carrying a weight too heavy for him. He never saw me. I paid for my things and left the image of his hollowed-out expression burned into my mind. The biggest crack appeared on Saturday when I went to pick up the grandkids. Usually, Caleb or Serafina would have them ready on the porch bags packed with forced, polite smiles. This time, the door was answered by a teenage babysitter I'd never seen before. They had to go to an emergency meeting, the girl explained, avoiding my eyes. They said they might be late. Inside the house was unnaturally quiet. I could hear Noah and Iris playing in their room upstairs. But as I waited in the stark white foyer, I heard something else. A low, tense murmur from behind Serafina's closed office door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of a hushed, frantic argument. When Caleb and Serafina finally emerged, the mask was gone. Serafina's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed beneath a layer of hastily applied makeup. Caleb's jaw was set so tightly it looked like it might crack. They didn't speak to each other. Dad, Caleb said, his voice flat. "Thanks for getting the kids. Is everything all right, son?" I asked, my voice neutral. Serafina shot me a look of pure venom. It was the first honest emotion I had seen from her in years. "Everything is perfectly fine." "Gideon," she said, her voice like chipping ice. "We're just aligning our strategic vision." She walked away without another word. Caleb watched her go, a look of helpless frustration on his face. He handed me the kids' backpacks, his hand brushing mine. It was trembling. "We'll see you Sunday," he mumbled, refusing to meet my gaze. I buckled the children into my truck, their innocent chatter a stark contrast to the icy silence I had just left. As we drove away, Iris looked back at the house. "Mommy and Daddy are fighting again," she said quietly, her small voice holding a universe of sadness. I reached back and squeezed her hand. I didn't need to hear the words of their argument. I didn't need to be in the room with the investors. I could see the results in the tremor of my son's hand, the hatred in my daughter-in-law's eyes, and the sadness in my granddaughter's voice. The veneer wasn't just cracking, it was beginning to peel away entirely, revealing the cheap, unstable material underneath. And it was happening right on schedule. The phone rang late on Monday night. I was sitting in my armchair reading an old book on joinery techniques, but my mind wasn't on the pages. I knew the meeting with North Star had happened that morning. The silence that followed it was heavier than anything that had come before. I picked up the phone. "Gideon." "Dad." Caleb's voice was hollow. stripped bare of all the frantic energy it had held before. It was the voice of a man who had been completely broken. "It's over." I didn't need to ask what he meant. I just listened, the old house silent around me. "They invoked a clause in the contract," he said, his words slow and detached, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else. "A founder integrity clause. They said her brand was built on a narrative that was demonstrably false. They're pulling all funding effective immediately." The words were clinical, but the devastation behind them was absolute. The entire structure I had targeted had just been condemned. "They gave her an option," he continued, his voice cracking. "They offered to buy out her shares for a fraction of what they were worth, just to dissolve the company quietly and salvage their own reputation. She took it." "I see," I said. It was all I could manage. My plan had worked. Better than I could have imagined. But hearing the finality in my son's voice brought no triumph. Only a cold, heavy emptiness. "She blames me, Dad," he whispered, and the sound was so full of pain it made my own chest ache. "She says this is all my fault. She said the first crack appeared with that blog post, and it was a sign of weakness. She said I was supposed to protect her, to protect the brand, but I let it all fall apart. I remained silent, letting him speak. We were in the car on the way home, and she just stared out the window. She didn't cry. She just said, 'This is what happens when you let sentimental baggage get in the way of business.' She was talking about you, Dad. About the chisels. She said that was the moment she knew I didn't have what it takes. My knuckles whitened around the receiver. So that was it. My gift wasn't just unwanted. In her mind, it was the root cause of their failure. My attempt to pass on a legacy had been twisted into a prophecy of weakness. She wants to sell the house," Caleb said, his voice finally breaking into a choked sob. "She said it's a tainted asset. She wants to move to start over somewhere else. Somewhere, away from here. Away from you." "Caleb," I started, but he cut me off. I had to tell someone," he stammered. "I have to go. She's packing." The line clicked dead. I sat there in the profound silence, the phone still pressed to my ear. It was over. I had won. I had meticulously, patiently, and precisely taken their world apart. I had exposed the lie. I had rescued my grandchildren from a future of curated falsehoods. But as I looked around my quiet, lonely workshop at the tools that had been my weapons and the memories that had been my fuel, I couldn't escape a single devastating thought. I had destroyed their house, but in the process, I had completely shattered my son. The silence that followed Caleb's call was heavier than any wood I had ever worked with. It filled the corners of my small house, pressing in on me. I had won. The words echoed in my mind, but they felt hollow, tasteless. There was no surge of triumph, no quiet satisfaction. There was only the ghost of my son's broken voice. I walked into my workshop, the scent of cedar and oil, usually a comfort now doing nothing to soothe the tremor in my soul. I looked at the tools arranged neatly on the walls. I saw the chisels my father had given me lying on the workbench. They looked different now, not like tools of creation, but like weapons. My goal had been simple, precise. I had meant to expose a lie, to remove a rotten beam from the structure of my family. But I had been careless. I hadn't considered the blast radius. In my focus to bring down Serafina's hollow facade, I had failed to see that my own son was standing right next to it. When it fell on him. I had imagined this moment differently. I had pictured a quiet victory, a restoration of balance. I thought that by exposing the truth I would free Caleb, free my grandchildren. I never intended to shatter him. I wanted to wake him up, not break him. The workshop, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. I shrugged on a jacket and stepped out into the cold Wisconsin night. The air was crisp, the sky, a vast star-dusted canvas. I walked the quiet streets of Havenwood Bluffs, my footsteps the only sound. I passed the town square, the old clock tower my great-grandfather had helped build, standing silent and proud. I thought of the generations of Adlers who had lived here, who had built things that lasted, houses, businesses, families. I had spent my life honoring that tradition, believing in the integrity of a well-made thing. What had I made tonight? I found myself at the edge of the lake, looking out across the dark, still water. On the far shore, I could see the faint, cold lights of the neighborhood where Caleb's house stood, his tainted asset. A place that was supposed to be a home now, just a casualty in a war he didn't even know he was fighting. I had done it for Noah and Iris. The thought was a lifeline, and I clung to it. I had saved them from a life of curated falsehoods, from a mother who saw them as brand extensions. But what kind of life would they have now, with a broken father and a bitter, defeated mother. The truth was a sharp, painful tool. I had wielded it with skill, but perhaps not with wisdom. Esther would have known. She would have seen the damage I was causing to Caleb. She would have found a gentler way, a way to mend instead of demolish. But she wasn't here. There was only me and the consequences of my calculated campaign. The war was over. I had won. But now, standing alone under the cold, indifferent stars, I had to face a new, terrifying question. What comes next? The work of destroying was done, but the work of rebuilding, I didn't know if I had the tools for that. The next few days passed in a heavy, silent haze. My workshop, usually a place of purpose, felt like a museum of my own mistakes. The maple rocking chair for Iris sat finished in the corner, a perfect piece of craftsmanship with an uncertain destination. I had no desire to start a new project. What was the point of building things if my own family was in ruins? I had become a ghost in my own life, haunted by the consequences of my precise, calculated victory. The phone rang on Thursday morning. It was Caleb. I braced myself for another wave of despair, or perhaps anger. But his voice held neither. It was just empty. "Dad," he said, his voice flat, "she's moving her things out on Saturday. I'm sorry to hear that, son." There was a long pause. I could hear him take a deep, shaky breath. "She's taking Noah and Iris with her, to her sister's place in Minnesota. Just for a while, she says. To detox from the toxic environment here." My heart seized. Minnesota. That wasn't just a short drive away. That was another state. Another world. A world without me in it. "Dad," Caleb's voice dropped, becoming fragile, hesitant. "I know this is a lot to ask. And I know things are bad between us. But I can't be in that house alone while she packs up their lives. I can't watch her take my kids away by myself." He finally choked out the words. Can you just be here on Saturday?" The request stunned me. He wasn't blaming me. He wasn't pushing me away. He was asking me to come back, to step into the very wreckage I had created. My mind raced. Was this some kind of trap, a test? Or was it simply a son, broken and alone, reaching out to his father? I looked across the workshop at the little rocking chair. I thought of Iris's laughter and Noah's serious, curious eyes. I thought of them being packed into a car and driven hundreds of miles away. The answer was never really in question. My war against Serafina was over. But my duty as a grandfather, as a father, that was for life. If this story is resonating with you, a quick like to show your support would mean the world to us. Now, back to Gideon's decision. "I'll be there, son." I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Just tell me what time." 9 o'clock, he said, a wave of palpable relief in his voice. "Thank you, Dad. Really." I hung up the phone. The haze in my mind began to clear, replaced by a heavy, somber sense of purpose. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. This was about showing up. It was about walking into the ruin, not to survey the damage I'd done, but to see if there was anything left to salvage. I wouldn't bring my tools. I wouldn't bring my anger. Or my pride. I would just bring myself. A father going to his son's side. I walked over to my father's chisels still lying on the workbench. I didn't touch them. I just looked at them for a long moment, then gently rolled the leather flap over them, covering the sharp gleaming steel. The time for cutting was over. Driving up to the house on Saturday morning felt like approaching the site of a controlled demolition. The stark white walls seemed even colder under the gray, overcast sky. A large moving truck was parked in the driveway, its rear doors gaping open like a hungry mouth, ready to swallow the life of the house. I parked on the street and walked up the pristine stone path. The front door was ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was no longer a sterile gallery. It was a chaotic landscape of cardboard boxes and emotional debris. Serafina was in the living room directing 2 movers with the cold efficiency of a field general. She wore expensive athletic wear, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She was all business. She saw me. Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, a flicker of pure hatred, and then she turned away, dismissing me as irrelevant. She didn't say a word. Caleb was standing by the large window where this had all begun, staring out at the lake. He was a statue carved from despair. He looked up as I entered, a flicker of gratitude in his hollow eyes. He didn't speak, just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I nodded back. There were no words for this. I just stood near the doorway, a silent, stationary witness, just as he had asked. The house was filled with the sounds of departure, the squeak of packing tape, the heavy tread of movers' boots, the low murmur of their voices. But underneath it all was a profound, deafening silence between my son and his wife. They moved through the same space but occupied different worlds, their orbits no longer touching. Then, the children came downstairs. Noah was holding his little sister's hand. They were dressed for travel, each clutching a small backpack. They stopped at the bottom of the stairs, their eyes wide, taking in the scene of their dismantled home. Iris saw me, and her face lit up. "Grandpa." She ran to me, wrapping her arms around my legs. I knelt and hugged her, burying my face in her soft hair, inhaling the innocent scent of childhood. "Are we going on a trip?" Noah asked, his voice quiet, too serious for his age. He looked from the boxes to his parents. "When are we coming back?" Serafina turned her composure, finally cracking. "Go wait in the car, Noah," she snapped, her voice sharp. "The driver is waiting." Caleb flinched as if struck. He knelt in front of Noah. "It's just for a little while, buddy," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "We'll talk on the phone every single day, I promise." He hugged his son fiercely, his whole body trembling. I watched the scene, my heart, a leaden weight in my chest. This was the wreckage. This was the cost of my victory. It wasn't just a failed business or a sold house. It was this moment, a little boy's confusion, a father's broken promise, a grandfather watching helplessly from the sidelines. Serafina ushered the children out the door without a backward glance at Caleb. He remained kneeling on the floor, staring at the empty doorway, a man completely adrift. I had come here to be with my son. I had done what he asked. But standing there in the ruins of his life, surrounded by the ghosts of a family that no longer existed, I had never felt more powerless. The craftsman knew how to take things apart. He had no idea how to put them back together again. The sound of the moving truck pulling away was final. It echoed in the empty house, leaving a silence that was heavier than any sound. Caleb was still on the floor, not kneeling anymore, but sitting his back against the wall, staring at the space where his family used to be. I didn't know what to do. I was a man who worked with wood, with tangible things. I could fix a wobbly chair leg or a stuck drawer. I couldn't fix this. I couldn't fix my son. So I just stood there, a silent sentinel in the doorway, giving him the one thing I had left to give my presence. Minutes stretched into an hour. The light in the room shifted as the sun moved across the sky. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice a rough, broken whisper. "I knew," he said, not looking at me. "Knew what, son? I knew it was all a lie. Her story. The debt-free journey." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "I was there when she signed the papers with North Star. I saw the numbers. I knew she was hiding it from her followers." I moved from the doorway and sat on the floor a few feet away from him, my back against the opposite wall. We were two broken men facing each other across a chasm of unspoken words. "Why, Caleb?" I asked softly. "Why go along with it?" He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was painful to see. "Because I was a coward," he said the words, raw, honest. She was so ambitious, so driven. She had this whole vision, this perfect life mapped out, and I just wanted to be a part of it. I was so afraid of losing her, of not being enough, that I just went along. I told myself it was just marketing, a story. But it wasn't. It was a lie, and it ate us from the inside out. He buried his face in his hands. "She said you were the problem. Your old-fashioned values, your sentimentality. She said you were a weakness, and I believed her. I pushed you away because I was too weak to stand up to her. I let her turn me against my own father." The confession hung in the air between us, raw and painful. It was everything I had suspected, everything I had fought against. But hearing it from him, seeing the toll it had taken, brought no satisfaction. "I am so sorry, Dad," he whispered. I looked at my son, not the hollowed-out man from the grocery store, but the boy who had once followed me around the workshop, his eyes wide with wonder. The boy I had taught to ride a bike and bait a hook. The boy I had failed to teach how to be strong in the face of a different kind of storm. I was not blameless in this. My silence, my retreat after his mother died, had left a void that Serafina had eagerly filled. My war had been precise, but my peace had been neglectful. I pushed myself to my feet, my old knees protesting. I walked over and offered my hand to Caleb. He looked up, surprised, then took it. I pulled him to his feet. "Come on, son," I said, my voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "There's nothing left for you here. Let's go home." Caleb moved into his old childhood bedroom. For the first few days, he barely left it. He slept or stared at the ceiling, a man hollowed out by grief and shame. I didn't push him. I just made sure there was hot coffee in the pot when he woke up and a warm meal on the table in the evening. We ate in silence, the quiet of the old house, a stark contrast to the echoing emptiness of his. I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer advice. I knew that some things, like a deep crack in an old piece of wood, can't be fixed with force. They require patience, gentle pressure, and the slow work of time. On the fourth morning, I was in the workshop planing a piece of cherry wood when the door creaked open. Caleb stood there silhouetted against the morning light. He looked thin, tired, but he was out of the bedroom. It was a start. He didn't say anything. He just watched me work. He watched as I guided the plane over the wood, the tool whispering as it shaved off paper-thin curls. He watched the grain emerge smooth and perfect under my steady hands. It was a language we both understood, a language of purpose and precision that we hadn't shared in years. After a long while, he picked up a broom and started sweeping the sawdust from the floor. He moved slowly, methodically, his movements clumsy at first, then more sure. He swept the entire workshop, not stopping until the concrete floor was clean. It was a small act, but it was an act. He was choosing to do something. The next day he came into the workshop again. This time he picked up a block of scrap pine and a piece of sandpaper. He sat on an old stool and began to sand, his hands moving back and forth, in a steady, repetitive motion. We worked like that for a week, side by side in a comfortable silence. The only sounds, the scrape of sandpaper and the whisper of the plane. We didn't talk about Serafina. We didn't talk about the investors or the house or the money. We just worked. We let the rhythm of the craft fill the space between us. One afternoon, he was sanding the little maple rocking chair I'd made for Iris. His touch was gentle, careful. "She'd love this," he said, his first unsolicited words in days. "I know," I replied. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. Do you think I'll get to see them again soon?" "I don't know, son," I said honestly. "But we'll figure it out. Together." It wasn't a promise of an easy fix. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would go back to the way it was. It couldn't. Too much had been broken. But it was the truth. We were together again. That evening after dinner, he didn't go back to his room. He stayed in the living room watching an old black and white movie with me. In the middle of it, he fell asleep on the couch, his face finally peaceful. The deep lines of stress eased for the first time in weeks. I draped a blanket over him and sat there in the dark watching my son sleep. The work of mending was slow. It was harder than any joinery, more delicate than any restoration. But for the first time since that day at the lake house, I felt a flicker of hope. I had taken his world apart. Now perhaps I could help him build a new one. Weeks turned into a month. A quiet routine settled over the house. We were like two pieces of wood that had been split apart, slowly being acclimated to the same environment, preparing to be joined again. Caleb started talking more. Not about the past, but about small things. The weather, a leaky faucet. He even started sketching designs for a small bookshelf and a notepad, the first flicker of his old creative spark returning. The hope in my chest began to feel less like a flicker and more like a steady flame. He spoke to Noah and Iris on video calls every night. I would hear his strained, cheerful voice from the other room telling them stories and asking about their day. But after each call, a shadow would fall over him. I knew he was hurting, but I also knew that some pains had to be weathered, not just fixed. One evening he came into the workshop after his call. He looked paler than usual, his hands clenched at his sides. "What's wrong?" I asked, putting down a chisel. "It's Serafina," he said, his voice tight. "She's enrolling the kids in school. In Minnesota. For the fall semester." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. This wasn't a temporary visit to her sisters anymore. This was a move, a permanent one. She was putting down roots, and she was taking his children with her. She said, "Havenwood Bluffs has too many toxic memories." Caleb continued, his voice breaking. "She said the kids need a clean slate. She's talking about lawyers, Dad. Custody agreements. She wants me to have them on holidays and for 2 weeks in the summer." 2 weeks. The words were an insult. He was their father. "What did you say?" I asked, my own voice, dangerously quiet. "What can I say?" he asked. throwing his hands up in despair. She holds all the cards. I'm unemployed. I'm living in my father's house. What judge would side with me? She'll paint me as an unstable failure, and she'll paint you as a destructive influence. He sank onto a stool, the fight completely gone from him. It's over. I've lost them. I looked at my son, defeated, and in that moment something shifted inside me. The quiet, patient craftsman who had spent the last month mending receded. In his place, the methodical, precise planner I had been during the war returned. But this time, his purpose was different. It was no longer about tearing down. It was about building up. I walked over to my desk and pulled out a clean legal pad and a pen. "No, son," I said, my voice firm, clear. "You haven't lost them. The fight just isn't over yet." Caleb looked up confused. "What are you talking about?" "There's nothing we can do. You're a good father, Caleb," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "You're a good man who made a mistake. But you are not unstable, and you are not a failure. We just need to prove it." I drew a line down the middle of the page. On one side, I wrote assets. On the other, strategy. "She thinks she holds all the cards," I said, the pen feeling steady and familiar in my hand. "But she's forgotten something. We're craftsmen. We don't just accept a flawed design. We find a way to make it right. This is just a new kind of project. And we're going to build you a case piece by piece until it's as solid as an oak table." The workshop became our war room. The scent of sawdust was replaced by the smell of brewing coffee and old paper. We weren't mending wood anymore. We were mending a life. My life had been about precision and planning, and now I was teaching those skills to my son. "First," I said, pointing to the assets column on the legal pad, "we list your strengths. What makes you a good father?" Caleb hesitated, the shame still clinging to him. I don't know, Dad. I feel like I've failed at everything." "Nonsense," I said sharply. "You read to them every night. You know how to make Iris's favorite pancakes. You spent a whole summer building that treehouse for Noah. Write it all down, every detail. We are building with facts, not feelings." For the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of the old Caleb. He picked up the pen and began to write. The list started small, then grew, each memory adding another layer of strength to his case. "Next we moved to strategy. She will call you a failure," I explained. "So you get a job, not just any job, something steady, something that shows responsibility." The next day, Caleb started his search. He didn't look for a high-powered marketing job. He went down to the local hardware store, a place I'd frequented for 30 years, and asked for a position. Mr. Henderson, the owner, hired him on the spot. It wasn't glamorous. It was stocking shelves and mixing paint, but it was honest work. It was a paycheck. It was a foundation. While he worked, I took on my own task. Serafina would paint me as a destructive influence. I decided to turn that on its head. I started volunteering. 3 days a week, I went to the Havenwood Bluffs Community Center and taught a free woodworking class for retirees. I taught them how to make birdhouses and small repair projects. It was public. It was positive. It created a narrative of a man who builds, not destroys. We worked in parallel, 2 craftsmen on the same project. In the evenings, we would sit at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. Caleb would talk about his day at the store, about the satisfaction of a hard day's work. He was standing taller. The hollow look in his eyes was being replaced by a quiet determination. One night he found an old portfolio of his from college. It was filled with sketches, designs for furniture, intricate and beautiful. "I forgot about this," he said, tracing a design for a curved maple bench. "I used to love this." "It's good work," I said. Maybe I could start again," he mused, a thought that would have been impossible a month ago. "In the workshop. Just small things." "The workshop is always open," I told him. I never told him about my role in Serafina's downfall. My war was a secret I would carry alone. This new project, this was something we were building together. He thought we were just building a legal case. But I knew we were doing something more important. We were restoring him. We were taking the broken pieces of the man he was. And with patience and hard work, we were slowly, carefully putting him back together again, stronger than before. It was a Saturday afternoon, 2 months after Caleb had come home. He was in the workshop, not sanding scrap wood anymore, but carefully carving a detail into the leg of a small end table he was building. The focused, confident look on his face was one I hadn't seen in years. The piece we had built felt solid, real. Then a sleek, unfamiliar rental car pulled into the driveway. Serafina stepped out. She looked different. Her hair was cut shorter, more severe. The expensive athletic wear was gone, replaced by a sharp, dark business suit. She looked like a predator who had been wounded and was now twice as dangerous. Caleb saw her through the workshop window. He tensed the carving tool still in his hand. He looked at me, a flicker of the old fear in his eyes. I just gave him a slow, steady nod. "You're ready for this." She didn't knock. She walked straight to the open workshop door, her heels clicking on the concrete. She ignored me completely, her eyes fixed on Caleb. "I'm back for the rest of my things," she said, her voice clipped, devoid of emotion. "And to finalize the custody papers. My lawyer sent them to you. I expect you to sign." Caleb carefully set his tool down on the workbench. He wiped his hands on a rag, taking his time. He was no longer the broken man who had knelt on the floor of their empty house. "I've read 'em, Serafina," he said, his voice calm even. "And I'm not signing." Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "Excuse me, this isn't a negotiation, Caleb. It's a formality. The court will side with me. You have nothing." "I have a job," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I have a home. And I have a father who supports me." He gestured around the workshop. "And I'm starting to remember who I was before I met you." For the first time, Serafina's composure cracked. A flash of disbelief, then fury, crossed her face. "This is pathetic," she sneered. "You're hiding in your father's dusty workshop, playing with wood chips, and you think that's a life I'm offering the children stability, a future." "You're offering them a life on the run from your own failures," Caleb countered, his voice steady. "You're taking them away from their home, their school, their grandfather. You're not doing it for them. You're doing it for you, to escape the mess you made." She took a step forward, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "That mess was your fault as much as mine. You were weak." "Yes," Caleb said, and the simple admission seemed to suck the air out of the room. I was weak, and I was afraid. But I'm not anymore." He picked up the half-finished table leg, its wood warm and solid in his hands. "I'm not signing those papers, Serafina. I'm going to fight for my kids, and I'm going to do it the right way. With honesty, we can let a judge decide what's best for them." Serafina stared at him, speechless. She was looking at a man she no longer recognized, a man she could no longer control. The power dynamic that had defined their entire relationship had just shifted right here in this dusty workshop. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her car. The engine roared to life, and she sped out of the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake. Caleb stood there for a long moment, the table leg still in his hand. Then he looked at me, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was the first one I had seen in years. 6 months later, the workshop was a different place. It was no longer a solitary sanctuary, but a hub of quiet, joyful creation. The air still smelled of sawdust, but now it mingled with the scent of varnish and the faint, sweet smell of the wildflowers. Iris insisted on putting in a jar on my workbench. Caleb's end table was long finished, sitting proudly in our living room. Now he was working on a project of his own design, a beautiful, sturdy set of bunk beds for the kids' room, his room. He had turned his old childhood bedroom into a space for Noah and Iris for when they came to stay. And they came to stay often. The legal battle had been quiet, anticlimactic. Faced with a son who was no longer broken, who had a steady job, a stable home, and the unwavering support of his father, Serafina's case crumbled. Her narrative of an unstable husband and a toxic grandfather didn't hold up against the simple, solid truth. The judge settled on a joint custody agreement that was fair and generous. The children spent 2 weeks of every month with us. Today was a Saturday, and the kids were here. Iris was sitting on the floor carefully painting the maple rocking chair I'd made for her in a vibrant, chaotic explosion of colors. Noah was standing beside Caleb at the workbench watching his father measure a piece of pine. "Okay, buddy," Caleb said, his voice patient and sure. "The rule is, measure twice, cut once. Can you check my numbers?" Noah leaned in, his small brow furrowed in concentration. "Looks right, Dad." "All right," Caleb said, giving his son's shoulder a squeeze. "Let's make some sawdust." I watched them from my armchair in the corner where I was sanding a small hand-carved bird for Iris. The sound of the saw, the murmur of my son's voice, teaching his own son the scent of wood and paint. The sight of my granddaughter creating her own beautifully imperfect masterpiece. It was a symphony of simple, profound joy. I never told Caleb what I had done. He never asked. Maybe on some level he knew, or maybe he didn't need to. The past was like a knot in an old piece of wood. It was part of the story, part of what gave the piece its character, but you didn't have to focus on it. You could work around it, smooth it down, and build something new and beautiful in spite of it. My war was over. I had won, but not in the way I had first intended. My victory wasn't the ruin of Serafina's empire. It wasn't the taste of revenge. It was this moment. It was the sound of my son's confident voice, the sight of my grandchildren safe and happy, learning the value of creating something real with their own two hands. I had set out to expose a lie, to take apart a hollow structure, but in the end the real project had been something else entirely. It had been about rebuilding a man. It had been about restoring a family. I looked down at the small bird in my hands, its surface now perfectly smooth. I had fought for this peace, for this simple, unshakable, and honest truth, and it was better than any victory I could have ever imagined. I leaned back in my old armchair, the small wooden bird resting on its arm, its surface worn smooth by my grandson's small hands. The setting sun cast long golden rays through the workshop windows, illuminating the dancing dust motes and catching the warm glow of the half-finished bunk beds. The sounds of my family, Caleb's patient instruction, Noah's eager questions, Iris's happy humming, were the most beautiful music I had ever known. The leather roll of my father's chisels lay on the workbench, not as a symbol of rejection or a weapon of war, but simply as what they were: tools meant for building. It had taken me a long, painful journey to remember that. My methods had been harsh. I had acted from a place of hurt, and in doing so, I had caused a different kind of hurt, a deeper kind. I had taken apart a hollow life, yes, but I had nearly lost my son in the wreckage. That was a truth I would have to live with. But life, much like wood, is resilient. It can be scarred, split, and broken. But with patience and the right kind of care, it can be mended. It might not ever be the same as it was before. The joints might show, the grain might tell a story of hardship, but sometimes those repairs, those visible signs of a life lived and a trial overcome, make the piece stronger and far more beautiful than it ever was in its pristine, untested state. My son was proof of that. He was quieter, now more thoughtful. He had lost a fortune built on lies, but he had found a wealth of self-respect in the simple act of a hard day's work. He was a better man and a better father than he had ever been. The greatest legacy we can pass on isn't a tool or a treasure. It's the wisdom to know what's real, the strength to choose the harder, more honest path, and the grace to forgive not just others, but ourselves for the mistakes we make while we're learning. That was the grain of truth I had been searching for all along. It wasn't something to be exposed, but something to be built day by day in the quiet workshop of the heart. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.